Hey guys, this is Christian Sawyer in Group 5. It's just going to be me today, so I'm going to be going through my process of the process of thinking while taking the quiz. So starting with question 3, the true linear regression equation is y equals beta sub naught plus beta sub 1x. So the null and alternative hypotheses are going to be beta sub 1 equals 0, and the alternative hypothesis being beta sub 1 does not equal 0. Moving on to question 4, I put a residual is the difference between the observed value y and the value predicted by the regression line. So it's just a calculation of differences. Question 5, a plot of residuals supports using linear regression when, and I put when the residuals look normally distributed. Like we saw in the reading, we're trying to make sure there's not too many points on one side or too many points on of data on the other side, which would make a megaphone shape. We're trying to make sure we're not seeing a pattern. Okay, moving on to question 6. It says compute the residuals for the data using software. What statement best describes the residuals? And I put the residuals are between -40 and 25. That's about all we can tell from the residual so far. Question 7, based on the QQ plot for these residuals, what can you say about these residuals? So when you put it in the software and do a QQ plot, you sort the values from lowest to highest. You'll see that it's fairly linear. And by knowing that it's fairly linear on that QQ plot, then we can say that the residuals are fairly normal. Question 8 says use software to create a scatter plot of the data. Given the scatter plot, residuals plot, and the QQ plot, which of the 5 assumptions about linear regression are satisfied by this data? Check all that apply. So I put 3. I put there is a linear relationship between x and y. The variance of the error term is constant for all values of x, and the residuals are normally distributed. These are the only 3 things we can directly determine based on the scatter plot, residuals plot, and the QQ plot. The other 2 options being the x values are measured without error and the observations are independent, we cannot directly determine whether those requirements are met given the scatter plot, residuals plot, and the QQ plot. Question 9 asks, what is the beta sub 1, the estimate for the slope? And after putting it into Excel, I was able to calculate the slope to be 12.695. Questions 10 and 11 asks to construct a 95% confidence interval for beta sub 1. For lower bound in Excel, I calculated 10.674, and in the upper bound, I calculated 14.715. Question 12 says, based on the evidence and using a level of significance alpha equals 0.05, what decision would you make regarding the hypothesis test for beta sub 1? So in Excel, I was able to see that the what we're trying to do when rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis, we're trying to see if the p-value is higher or lower than the level of significance. And in this, I saw that the p-value was much less than the level of significance. So I put that we'll reject the null hypothesis test because the p-value is less than the level of significance, 0.05. Question 13, excuse me. For a hypothesis test for beta sub 1, the slope, if you reject the null hypothesis, what does it mean? So going back to question 3, where it asks what the null and alternative hypotheses are, we can say that there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the slope of the regression line is not 0. So we're rejecting the null and moving on to our alternative hypothesis, which says that it is not equal to 0. Going on to question 14 with the crocodile data. Question 14 asks, for this data, which variable is the dependent variable? So dependent variable is y. The independent variable is x. And in this study, the dependent variable is body length. Questions 15, 16, 17 asks to construct a confidence interval for beta sub 1, the slope. So margin of error I calculated to be 0.443. Excel says that the lower bound is 7.218 and the upper bound is 8.103. And moving on to question 18, finally it asks, based on your lower bound and upper bound from the last two problems, what can you say about beta sub 1, the slope? And so from this, with our confidence interval, the correct statement would be that we are 95% confident that the confidence interval will contain the true value of the slope. And that's how we did this quiz. Thanks, guys.